All right. Well, let's go ahead and formally start the program. Welcome. Thank you to everyone for joining our webinar, Our Wild Watershed, Monarch Butterflies with Angela Laws. If you haven't already done so, please say hello in the chat. And you can do that by hovering over the bottom of your Zoom screen and selecting the chat button. My name is Christine Fontaine. I'm the Director of Education here at the Laguna de Santa Rosa Foundation. The Laguna sits within the homeland of the Coast Miwok and Southern Pomo people. To raise awareness for ancestral and modern Indigenous peoples' presence in the Laguna de Santa Rosa watershed, we pay our respect to the past, present, and future generations of Coast Miwok and Southern Pomo people and their Wapo neighbors. If you'd like to know more about the Indigenous land you live on, visit the Native Land website at native-land.ca to get started. The Laguna Foundation is a nonprofit organization based in Santa Rosa, California that works to restore, conserve, and inspire appreciation for the Laguna de Santa Rosa. The Laguna is a 22-mile-long wetland complex with a 254 square mile watershed that encompasses the businesses, infrastructure, farmland, open space, and people living in the Sonoma County communities of Santa Rosa, Cotati, Rohnert Park, and parts of Sebastopol and Windsor. The Laguna de Santa Rosa wetlands have been heavily impacted over time by development within its watershed and across the Santa Rosa Plain, and it now faces important issues that drive our restoration, conservation, and education work today. However, that's not the whole story. Despite the challenges, the Laguna is a biodiversity hotspot, home to endangered plants and animals, and it has the very special designation of being a wetland of international importance, one of only 34 sites in the United States with this honor. We conserve and restore these special wetlands by planting native trees, shrubs, grasses, and flowers, managing invasive species, and by collaborating with our agency and nonprofit partners to improve the health of the Laguna. We increase public knowledge and appreciation of the Laguna through our Learning Laguna elementary school programs, our Camp Tule summer camp, and community programs like this webinar today. Thank you so much to all of you who included a donation with your registration for this program. Your financial support is greatly appreciated. Our organization does rely on donations from individuals like you to continue our critical restoration, conservation, and education work. You can also donate securely on our website, and I will include a link to that in the chat and in the follow-up email. We have many more webinars and in-person events coming up this fall. Check out our community education webpage on our website for more information on upcoming events, including a discussion on greenbelts in Sonoma County on November 3rd, and another webinar in the series, Our Wild Watershed, that'll be on beavers, and that's on December 5th. I'll include the link to our community education page in the chat in just a minute. This presentation is being recorded and it will be available to view on our YouTube channel by this weekend. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat box throughout the program. I will be monitoring the chat and will pose our questions to Angela after she does her PowerPoint presentation. You can select who you're chatting with by using the gray drop-down box above right where you type your message. All right, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Angela Laws, PhD, is the Endangered Species Conservation Biologist and Climate Change Lead for the Xerces Society. Based in Sacramento, California, Angela is working on habitat restoration for pollinators and monarch butterflies in the Central Valley. Her role at the Xerces Society also involves incorporating climate resiliency into pollinator restoration projects. Angela has over 20 years of experience studying arthropods in grassland habitats, including studies of how climate change can affect species interactions. Angela, thank you for being here with us tonight. And with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you. I'm really excited to see so many people from all over the country. Can you see my slides?
Yes, I can.
And I noticed a few from outside the US as well. So that's exciting. Today I'm going to talk about protecting monarchs and other pollinators in our communities. I'm going to talk about the biology of monarchs, especially Western monarchs, the conservation status, and then things that we can do to help. It always takes a minute. There we go. So those of you who are familiar with Xerces, we are a nonprofit focused on protecting biodiversity by protecting invertebrates. We have major programs in pollinator conservation, and a lot of that work focuses on working lands and ag lands. We have a program for pesticide reduction, and we work on endangered species protection. We do a lot of education and outreach. We provide technical guidance, and we also do a lot of on-the-ground restoration. And we have been working on monarch biology, especially Western monarchs, for over 20 years. So today we're going to talk about basics of monarchs. We're going to talk about their conservation status and then how we can help. So there are two general populations of monarchs. There are the Western monarchs that generally breed west of the Rocky Mountains and overwinter along the California coast. And then we have the Eastern monarchs that breed east of the Rocky Mountains and overwinter in central Mexico. There is some mixing between these populations that probably occurs in the Southwest. The two populations are not genetically distinct. Now, what happens is each generation, so for example, if we're thinking about the Eastern monarchs, they overwinter in Mexico, and then each successive generation moves farther and farther north. So those adults live about a month as adults, but then that last generation in the fall that makes it all the way up into Canada, those individuals migrate all the way back to Mexico, spend the winter there, and then it's those same individuals that are the first ones to breed in the spring. So the overwintering adults live for about 9 months. The phenology, so the timing of different biological events, so the timing of when they leave and the overwintering sites and how long they breed and things like that, for the Western population were very poorly understood until recently. And it's through community scientists reporting their observations that we've learned a lot more about them. So the overwintering monarchs hang out along the California coast, and then they spread out into the west, like west and north, throughout the summer before coming back to the coast. But unlike the Eastern populations, they kind of pool out, and you can find monarchs breeding throughout California throughout the summer. And much of the West, actually. So the Western population is a little bit different in that way. Monarchs use milkweed as their host plant. So butterflies and moths have host plant, which is the plant that the larvae or the caterpillar has to feed on to mature into an adult. So for monarchs, they need to feed on milkweed. So the female will lay the egg. They lay the eggs individually, usually on the bottom of the leaf of a milkweed plant. And you can see an egg there. They're pretty tiny, like the size of the tip of a pencil. And they have these vertical ridges in them. The eggs take about 3 to 5 days to hatch. And then you see, this is a first instar larvae here. So the caterpillars go through several developmental stages called instars. This is the first instar. He's a teeny tiny little fellow, but they grow quickly. It actually takes about 10 to 14 days for them to go through this part of their life cycle. They go through 5 instar stages before forming the chrysalis. And during this time, they're feeding on milkweed. And milkweed is actually, it contains these toxins called cardenolides that are really bad. They taste bad, make you sick. But the monarchs are able to sequester them away, like store them in their body without getting sick, and it provides them a protection from predators. So there was actually a study quite a while ago looking at this, and they were like watching like blue jays throw up caterpillars that had been fed on milkweed. So it provides them from a protection. Once they form the chrysalis, they have these beautiful structures. It's got like these metallic gold stripes and spots on them. This stage lasts another 10 to 14 days. So it takes about 1 month from egg to adult. And then, as I said before, during the breeding season, the adults live for about a month, sometimes a little bit longer. During the overwintering season, those adults live for up to 9 months. The monarchs use milkweed for many different things. It's an oviposition site. So that's a fancy word for the place where they lay their eggs. It's the food source for the caterpillars. They will sometimes form the chrysalis on the milkweed, though they use other structures as well. This summer I had one form a chrysalis on our trash can. So we had to wait a couple weeks before we could bring the trash can to the curb to be taken out. And it can also be an adult nectar source. So unlike the caterpillars that are feeding only on milkweed, the adults are generalists. They drink nectar as opposed to the caterpillars that eat leaves. And the adults will take nectar from a variety of different plants. So they'll use many different species of plants, but they do use milkweed. In the West, and I know that there are a lot of people here who aren't from the West, there are approximately 72 species of milkweed. In the US and Canada, about 44 species are found in the West, with about 15 here in California. Showy milkweed is the most broadly distributed species in the Western US, though in California, narrow leaf milkweed is probably the most widely distributed. So monarchs have been documented using about 20 species of milkweed as larval host plants. They probably use more, but many of these species are just rare. So there aren't reports of monarchs using those species. Milkweeds can be found in a variety of different habitats, everything from disturbed roadsides to grasslands to deserts, wetlands. So what that means is because most habitats can support some species of milkweeds, most habitats could also support breeding monarchs. When monarchs overwinter, they form these wonderful clusters. So you see in this photo, I think this is one of the reasons people are so drawn to monarchs, is they have this really amazing migratory behavior and they form these beautiful clusters in the trees. This map shows the overwintering sites in California. The orange triangles are the sites that have been monitored through the Thanksgiving count, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And the blue sites are sites that have not been monitored. So in these overwintering sites, monarchs are looking for really specific climatic conditions. It needs to be the right temperature and the right humidity. They need to be protected from wind and freezing temperatures. If it gets too cold, they could die. But if it gets too warm, they start burning up those energy reserves that are there to get them through to the spring. They need really specific conditions. They also need nectar sources. While they're in these overwintering sites, they're in reproductive diapause. So that means that they're just sort of in a holding pattern. They're not mating, they're not producing eggs, they're just kind of waiting. They will move around a bit, they'll fly short distances, they'll drink nectar. So nectar sources are really important in these overwintering sites. Okay, so when you have a population like monarchs that span an entire continent, it can be really difficult to determine how big the size of that population is. So how do you do that? Well, you wait until they form clusters like these at the overwintering site, which makes them a lot easier to count. They're relatively stationary and they're all in the same place. This is an aerial photo of a monarch overwintering site in Mexico. These are sacred firs where the monarchs overwinter. And you can see these trees look dead. They're all brown and dried looking. It looks like they're all desiccated. All that brown is actually from monarch butterflies. They're so thick that they turn the trees brownish orange. So the way we measure over the size of the eastern monarch population is to estimate the amount of area of trees that are occupied by monarchs. So that's how we do it for that population. For the Western monarchs, we use the Western Monarch Thanksgiving count. So this is a community science effort that was started in 1997 by Xerxes and Mia Monroe, who works for the National Park Service. Basically, volunteers come out, at least in pairs, 2 or more people, go out and basically try to count all the monarchs they can see in each cluster and count the number of clusters to estimate the number of monarchs overwintering along the coast. And then in 2017, we started a New Year's count so that we could get an idea of how the population was changing over the winter. And these volunteers also do habitat assessments so we can get an idea of how healthy each of these overwintering sites is. You can get more information at this westernmonarchcount.org. If you're interested in volunteering for next year's count, I think it's sort of late this year, but next year we're always looking for new people to help out. And there's also a lot of cool information there. Like if you, there's an interactive map, like if you want to see which overwintering sites you live closest to, you can find that there. And you can also find a lot of data and other resources. So these are the data. Along the x-axis, we have year. So again, this was started in 1997 all the way to 2020. And these green bars are the total monarch abundance. So how many monarchs did we measure across all the sites? And you can see in 1997, there were 1.2 million monarchs overwintering along the California coast. And then that number decreased and sort of hovered around 200,000 per year. This blue line is the number of sites monitored. So you can see starting in 2010, we got a lot more wonderful community scientists helping us do this, and we were able to monitor more sites. The numbers stay about the same, which tells us that over time, we started to see fewer butterflies per site. So what happened is that in 2017, as you see, there were about 200,000 monarchs overwintering along the coast. In 2018, that number dropped 86% to less than 30,000 monarchs. 2019, the number was about the same, so less than 30,000 butterflies along the coast. And then last winter, we counted less than 2,000 monarchs along the entire coast, which is a huge, huge decline, a 99% decline from the 1980s when there were an estimated 4 million monarchs overwintering along the California coast. That's a huge drop. It's concerning, obviously, but I do have some good news to share, which is that we have some preliminary data from community scientists out there counting at the overwintering sites, and it looks like right now, we've counted at least 10,000 monarchs, 8,000 at Pismo Beach, 1,200 at Pacific Grove, and some other good numbers at some other sites. So that's very encouraging. At least we've had a good year. The population has at least gone up. It looks like the numbers are going to be higher than last year. That's really positive. So yeah, if you live near Pismo Beach State Park, it's a good time to go see some monarchs. So all is not lost. And you know, insect populations bounce around a lot. They're really highly variable. And so that is one good thing about monarchs and other butterflies, is that their numbers could rebound given the right conditions. So why is this happening? Why are monarchs declining? I think a lot of people would like to have one answer. It's just one thing, this is the cause. But we think it's actually a mix of many different factors that are causing monarchs to decline. And the factor that's most important may change among years or among places. But the things that we think are most important to contributing to these declines in Western monarchs are loss of habitat and degradation of habitat in the overwintering sites, loss of habitat and habitat degradation in the breeding habitat, widespread use of pesticides, especially insecticides, climate change, and then parasites, diseases, and predators can also play a role. Now, we've been focusing on monarchs, but I would just like to point out that many butterflies in California and in the world are also declining. Here in California, we have 15 butterflies that are listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act, and 1 candidate butterfly and 1 listed moth. And a recent paper published this year was a study looking at 3 different long-term data sets for Western butterflies, so butterflies in the whole Western US. And what they found was that butterflies have been declining at a rate of 1.6% a year, which seems small, but over the last 40 years, they've been declining at that rate. So it's a huge loss of butterfly abundance and occurring across many different species and kinds of butterflies. So this is very worrying. And what this tells us is that what we're seeing with monarchs are really visible and charismatic species that a lot of people feel very connected to is happening for many species of butterflies. Here in California, there's a biologist named Art Shapiro. He's at UC Davis. He has been monitoring butterflies in Northern California for over 45 years. He's got this series of transects that run from the Bay Area all the way up to Donner Pass, so high in the mountains. And what they have also found is that many species of butterflies are declining, especially at the low elevation sites in the Central Valley. And many of these species, about 23, were showing actually stronger declines than monarchs. Though of course, that was before last year when the numbers crashed to 2,000, so that may change the ranking. But the point is there are a lot of butterflies in the West that also need our attention. There are also a lot of species of bees that need our help. Estimates are that 50% of leafcutter bees, 27% of mason bees are at risk of extinction. About 28% of North American bumblebees are at risk, including about 8 species that occur here in California. So I just want to raise awareness of this. I think that people pay a lot of attention to monarchs, as they should, but there are a lot of other pollinators that need our help as well. And the reasons that they're declining are similar to the reasons that monarchs are declining. Loss of habitat, pesticides, climate change. For bees, disease is really important. They can catch diseases from managed bees like honeybees or managed bumblebees. But the good news is that when we try to help monarchs, we can help many of these other species. But I just don't want to forget about them. Okay, so let's come back to this list, this depressing list of threats, and I'll talk about some of these in more detail. So in California, there is no formal protection for monarch overwintering sites. And in the past few years, more than 50 of these overwintering sites have been lost due to housing developments, and there are more threatened each year. We continue to lose sites. Some of them have been lost to wildfire, some of them to development. And another problem is that these groves need to be actively managed to protect them so that they remain good habitat for monarchs. One problem is if the trees start to senesce, if more trees aren't planted, that can make the grove unhospitable to monarchs. We have a publication on the state of the overwintering sites if you're interested in that on our website. So one problem we have is that eucalyptus trees are really short-lived, so they tend to senesce. And then you add on to that drought, which is becoming more and more common here in California. That means that pests and disease can have stronger negative impact on trees during droughts. So all of these together can kind of lead to degraded habitat. And so that's one reason that these overwintering sites need to be actively managed, so that we're planting new trees when they need to be, that we're protecting these habitats so that they can continue to provide safe overwintering sites for monarchs. Similarly, habitat loss in the breeding areas is also important. Habitat loss is sort of the main culprit when you think about biodiversity loss worldwide for all sorts of kinds of animals and plants. Let's talk about pesticides. So we wanted to know how much pesticides are monarchs encountering in milkweed in California, right? Because California is a really important part of the Western monarch range. They're coming through the Central Valley on their migration in spring and fall. So what is the condition of that milkweed? So what we did is we collected 227 milkweed plants from around the Central Valley. We collected it from agricultural sites, urban sites, and natural areas. This was in June of 2019. And then we sent the leaves out to a lab to find out how many pesticides were in these leaves. And what we found was that out of 227 plants, every single one had pesticides in it, with an average of 9 different pesticides per plant. This is a problem if we're concerned about conservation of monarchs and other pollinators. 64 different pesticides were found. I think part of this is because California has such a diverse agriculture, right? Where we grow lots of different crops. And so that can require lots of different pesticides, or lots of different pesticides get used on those different crops. However, the samples that had the highest numbers of pesticides there was one roadside that was near some farmland, but the rest were all the ones we purchased from nurseries. And they had an average of 25 different pesticides per plant. Those were the ones we bought. So that's problematic. And there's another issue of pesticide drift. So I said we collected some of these from urban areas, including the backyards of Xerxes employees. And my coworker, who's lived in her house for 6 years and never uses pesticides, had 11 different pesticides in her milkweed, and she was very upset. But this is the problem with pesticide drift, right? The pesticides in your yard or at your school or your work aren't just what's being sprayed there. It's what the neighbors on this side are spraying, and the neighbors on this side, and people across the street, and what the city is spraying. All of this is moving around on the wind and contaminating our plants that the caterpillars are then eating. So that's a problem. Another problem are systemic pesticides like neonicotinoids. So this is one example of a systemic insecticide. So what does that mean? So this picture, this little cartoon here kind of shows what that means. So if you spray the leaf of a plant with a systemic insecticide, the plant takes it up, and then that pesticide gets expressed in all the tissues of the leaf. So maybe the plant gets sprayed before it even flowers, but because it's systemic, that pesticide is going to show up in the nectar and the pollen, as well as in the leaf tissue. The problem with neonicotinoids is that they're very long-lived. They can last in the environment for months, sometimes years, in examples with trees. The other problem with these pesticides is they get in the soil and get taken up by neighboring plants. So maybe you buy a plant that says it's neonic free, which we did, and it had neonics in it. So you buy a plant and you plant it, you could potentially be contaminating the other plants in that habitat if that plant has been treated with neonicotinoids. So this is a real problem. I think that when people think about pesticide use, they think about ag lands, they think about crops, but pesticide use can be just as high in cities and towns as it is in agriculture. It can sometimes be higher. So I think this is an area where if we really care about monarch conservation, I think this is an area where there's a lot of room for improvement and a lot of room for benefiting pollinators by reducing pesticide use around our homes. Okay, climate change. Climate change can have many different types of effects on pollinators, including monarchs. I'm just going to talk about a few. So insects are really responsive to temperature. Temperature affects all sorts of things. It affects how fast they grow, how big they are when they mature, how many eggs they laid, how fast they digest their food, how active they can be. And so all of these things are affected by temperature. And sometimes if it gets too warm, for example, it can have negative effects on their fitness. If it gets too hot, and it can be stressful. Phenology is the timing of biological events. So for example, with monarchs, if it gets really warm, they may begin leaving overwintering sites earlier in the spring. And there's some evidence that this might be happening. But if the timing of milkweed emergence isn't also increasing, then you get this potential mismatch between the pollinator and the plant that they're relying on. So maybe the monarchs have left the overwintering site, they're looking to breed, but the milkweed isn't available yet. Many species are expected to change their ranges in response to climate change. In general, we'll see species move farther to higher latitudes and higher altitudes. This maybe isn't as applicable to monarchs as to other types of pollinators. But again, for species to shift their range, they need habitat to move to and habitat to move through. And then climate change can combine with other stressors. So these other things that we talked about, habitat loss, pesticide use, disease, all of these things can combine with climate change to have sort of magnify the negative effects of these factors on pollinators. So we have to think about that. In terms of specific effects on monarchs, I worry about warming winters. Again, remember I said that we need really specific conditions in the overwintering sites. If it gets too warm, will they be able to last throughout the winter? Will they have enough energy stores to make it through winter? The climate change will bring with it increased extreme events, so extreme weather events. So again, in the overwintering site, if you have extreme storms, bad storms, that can lead to high mortality of the butterflies. In California, we're getting more and more drought, which can reduce the quality of nectar and milkweed on the landscape. So these are all ways that climate change can affect monarchs and other pollinators. And then disease, parasites, and predation can also play a role here. Naturally, only about 1 to 10% of monarch eggs survive to adulthood, and that's sort of common in nature. It's the caterpillar stage is vulnerable. They have lots of potential predators like birds, some parasitic flies, praying mantids, and so on. There's also a parasite called OE, which is what this unfortunate butterfly on the left has been infected with. This OE reduces the migration effect or success and can slow development. So you can't always tell if they're infected with it. So one problem here in California and in other warm climates is that this OE disease can build up on tropical milkweed. So tropical milkweed is a native to California or the US, and it stays green all year unless you're in somewhere that gets like proper winter and snows, unlike here in the Central Valley. So it stays green. So what happens is these butterflies have the OE, they land on it, the OE transfers onto the plant, the next butterfly comes and picks it up. And so it kind of builds up over time. The native milkweeds die back in the fall, and so the OE kind of dies with it. But with the tropical milkweed, it can build up to really high levels. So there's really high levels of OE in, for example, Southern California, where there's a lot of tropical milkweed. So we recommend planting the native milkweed plants. I took the slide out and then I saw some folks from Texas, so I put it back in. These are some data on OE infections for sites in Texas with and without tropical milkweed. So on the left, these blue dots are sites that have tropical milkweed and native milkweed, and these pink dots have only native milkweed. And what happens is with this tropical milkweed, because it doesn't nest, they start to get year-round resident monarchs that are on this milkweed year-round. So what they find is that they looked at migrating butterflies coming through and landing. So the migrants are here in these black bars. And when they stop at the pink sites with no milkweed, only a small proportion of them are reproductively active, about 10%. And again, remember when they're overwintering, they're in diapause. They're supposed to be in diapause. This is fall. We have the residents, the year-round residents on the tropical milkweed here, this gray bar, about half of them are reproductively active. The weird thing is when the migrants come through and land in these places with tropical milkweed, now we're seeing high proportion that are also reproductively active. The other thing we notice is the proportion of infected monarchs that are infected with OE. So at the stopover sites with no monarchs collected at these stopover sites with no tropical milkweed have very low proportion of OE. In the sites with tropical milkweed, the year-round residents were almost 100% infected, and the migrants that came through then got infected at a higher rate, about 25 to 30% infected, compared to the ones stopping over at places without tropical milkweed. So we kind of subscribe to the precautionary principle to try and be cautious, and so that's why we advocate for not planting tropical milkweed in places where you don't get snow that will kill it in the winter. If you have it, cut it back in the fall. Just cut it down like in October, and that will also help with the problem with OE. Okay, so that was all a little bit depressing maybe. But the fact is there's a lot we can do to help monarchs and other pollinators. The things we can do, we can protect the overwintering sites. We can protect and restore breeding habitat. And the more habitat we're able to protect, the more we can increase habitat connectivity. And that just means pieces of habitat that are close to each other, connected, that form pathways for animals to move through. We can reduce pesticide use, especially insecticides. We can address climate change. And I think that's something we have to pressure our representatives to do at all levels of government. And we can contribute to community science. And I put this on here to remind me. So we did petition monarchs to be, Xerxes and many other people, submitted a petition to have monarchs listed under the Endangered Species Act. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service found that listing of monarchs was warranted but precluded, meaning there was enough evidence to show that they would be justified in listing monarchs under the Federal Endangered Species Act, but there are other species whose case is more urgent. So right now they're slated to be listed in 2024 unless something changes. So there are many opportunities to create monarch habitat in our communities. Our yards are obvious, but if you don't have a yard, that doesn't mean you can't help. There's a lot of places around our communities where we can create habitat. So public gardens, in parks or at schools or libraries, these are all great opportunities to have habitat. Offices are a great place. This is monarch habitat in this photo at an office building in Oregon. Churches, commercial areas, I feel like every commercial area in America seems to have the same standard landscaping. What if we could get businesses to plant milkweed and nectar plants instead of this sort of the standard non-flowering shrubs that are everywhere? And here in California, that would mean less water needed, and in other parts of the West as well. Rights of way, so along roadsides or power lines, these are great opportunities to add habitat, abandoned lots, and so on. And I think the more we start thinking this way and looking around our communities, I think we'll see a lot more places where we can add habitat. And I think the point is that no space is too small. If all you have is a room for a few pots in your patio, that's great. Or, you know, container gardens, parking strips. I think that's really, it shouldn't be dismissed because it's too small. Because first of all, pollinators are small, and so you can provide meaningful resources in these small spaces. But also, it's not just what I'm doing. It's not just the habitat in my yard that matters. It's the habitat in my neighbor's yard and in the house down the street and the pollinator garden at the park nearby. So it's thinking about this as a community landscape scale. It's not just what I'm doing, it's what everyone's doing. And that all builds up to something really meaningful, especially if we're all planting these great habitat plants and not spraying them with pesticides. We can have a really big impact, no matter how small our space is. So what does high quality monarch habitat look like for the breeding habitat? Again, the overwintering habitat's different. They don't need milkweed because, again, they're reproductive diapause. They need trees, they need nectar. In the breeding habitat, they need native milkweeds. Again, this is what the larvae eat. The adults drink nectar. They need nectar plants. This is the adult energy source. In the West, we think that nectar that blooms early in spring and late in fall is especially important for supporting the migration. They need habitat that's protected from pesticides and pathogens and other features such as shade. What about pollinators? I talked about pollinators in general. They need food, so nectar, pollen. Butterflies and moths need host plants. They need shelter and nest sites. So most bees actually nest in the ground. They like a little bit of bare ground to nest in. So if you have some areas in your garden that don't have mulch, they don't have to be big. It doesn't have to be a big patch, just little patches of bare ground. And some bees are cavity nesting bees. So they like pithy stemmed plants, things like wild rose or elderberry. And they, again, also need safe habitat that's protected from pesticides, especially systemic pesticides like neonicotinoids and pathogens. This photo is a bumblebee die-off that occurred near our main headquarters in Portland when a flowering tree was sprayed with neonicotinoids. These are all bumblebees. Okay, so some tips for creating a pollinator garden. You want to use a variety of flowering plants. You want to have at least 3 species flowering at all times during the active season, but more is better. So the more kinds of flowers you can have, the more pollinators you can support, the more kinds of pollinators you can support. So you want to think about things like bloom time, color, flower shape. Different sized bees will pollinate different sized flowers and different shaped flowers. Pollinators tend to like flowers planted in masses. So if you have a bunch of poppies together, like in this photo, they tend to be drawn to that. We generally advocate planting native plants. Native plants will support a wider range of pollinators just because those pollinators have evolved using those plants. Native plants are also more likely to support specialists, bees and butterflies, the ones that have those really specific resource requirements, including nest sites, some bare ground, some of those pithy stemmed plants. Many butterflies and moths use native trees as host plants. So that's a really great thing to do, is to plant trees. It can also help with heat waves. I see I have trees on there twice. And then of course, you want to protect your habitat from pesticides. So don't spray in and around your habitat. For the birders in the house, the bonus you get from planting native plants is that they attract more insects than ornamental plants and non-natives. And many birds rely on insects for food, at least for some part of their lifespan. Doug Tallamy, if you've ever heard him talk, he gives these amazing talks on native plantings. He and his students did a recent study looking at chickadees. This was in the Northeast, and they found that only yards that had at least 70% native plants were able to produce enough insects to support stable chickadee populations. So by planting lots of more native plants, we can provide more insects, which will help support larger bird populations. Okay, so for monarchs, again, we recommend native milkweeds. Here in California, narrowleaf milkweed is going to be appropriate for most of the state. Showy milkweed is another one that's common and commercially available. Our rule of thumb is to plant milkweeds where they occurred historically, though I feel that that's important. Though in home gardens, I guess I feel slightly less strict about. I would consider planting, for example, California milkweed in my yard, even if it wasn't in Sacramento area, but it's still native to the state. So there are degrees of this. California milkweed is an important one because it emerges early in the spring. It pops up a little bit earlier than these other species. And so as monarchs are leaving their overwintering site, we think they might be starting to leave a little bit earlier. There's this window of time where we think there might not be enough milkweed on the landscape. So we're working, and several other groups are working to expand the availability of species like California milkweed. Again, we don't think milkweed need to be planted near the overwintering sites. And if you can, try to plant multiple species, if you can, if it's appropriate, just because that expands the amount of time that the milkweed are available for monarchs. Again, California milkweed emerges earlier, but it senesces earlier. So if you have California milkweed and narrowleaf milkweed, you're going to have milkweed available for a longer period of time. Adult monarchs need nectar. So using a variety of plants. On our website, we have a ton of plant lists. We have regional plant lists for California. We have monarch plant lists for regions all over the US. I think every state just about has a list of appropriate monarch plants. So you can find that there. You want to make sure you have plants blooming spring through fall. And as I said before, here in the West, early spring and late fall are really important periods of time where we need to make sure that monarchs have nectar available to fuel their migration. This is the Peyote Mint, which was actually taken in my backyard. This photo. Shade, I think, can be really important for perching. There's some evidence that monarchs like to lay their eggs on shaded milkweed for the Western monarchs. In hot climates like we get here in the Central Valley and other parts of the Western US, trees and shrubs can be especially important for providing shade for monarchs for perching. And if you see on this picture, this photo was taken at a little nature preserve in Sacramento. You can see out front where it's full sun, all of the showy milkweed is senesced, but back in the shade, under the shade of this nice oak tree, a lot of the showy milkweed's still green. So having some shade there is sort of extending the life of some of these milkweed plants so that it's available longer for the monarchs. And again, we need to protect our habitat that we create from pesticides. So avoid using pesticides for cosmetic reasons. Most insecticides are broad spectrum, and that means they kill a wide range of insects and arthropods. So maybe you're spraying around your house because you don't want spiders or you don't want aphids, but those pesticides are probably broad spectrum, meaning they'll also kill bees and butterflies. As I said before, some insecticides can stay in the environment for a long time. So it's something we need to think about. You can talk with your community leaders, neighbors, business owners, and so on about reducing pesticide use in your community. In Sacramento, for example, there's a city ordinance against using neonicotinoids on city property. So there are different things that people are pushing to try and protect pollinators and other living things from these pesticides. You can also do your best to buy bee-friendly or pollinator-safe plants. So we have a new fact sheet on this on our website. We have a fact sheet on buying bee-safe plants, and we have one for nurseries on providing bee-safe plants. But the idea is to try and find organic plants and seeds. We want to avoid plants grown with neonics and other similar systemic insecticides. And those fact sheets will give you a list of the things you need to look out for. And I think a really important thing we can do is talk to people at the nursery, tell them we want plants that are safe for pollinators. And I think that that's really powerful. I think that people at nurseries want to do the right thing. Certainly nobody wants to kill pollinators, right? I think though, if they start hearing from more and more customers that this is something that's important to them, I think that that could really lead to important change. But I think the other side of that then is being willing to purchase plants that maybe have some leaf damage on it, right? That it doesn't look pristine. And that's because those insects have been allowed to, to survive around those plants. So a few of my favorite pollinator plants. I realize there are people here from all over. I'm in California, and this, so these are some of my favorite California plants. Buckwheats, I love buckwheats. They're really cool looking plants. Bees and butterflies love them. Here in California, there's something like 26 different species of butterflies that specialize on buckwheats as host plants, the way monarchs specialize on milkweeds. So they're a really great pollinator plant. Phacelias here on the right are bee magnets. If you want bees in your yard, plant phacelias. Most of them are annuals. Most of them bloom in the spring. They have these really cool, some of them have these really cool flower shapes. Bees can't get enough. They're really fun to watch. Peyote mint is probably my favorite pollinator plant in my yard. It smells nice, it's pretty, but the best thing about it is as soon as it blooms, I start getting lots more butterflies in my yards, including monarchs and this wonderful skipper. Goldenrod is a great late summer blooming plant that hosts tons of different insects. It's just an all around great plant. Sages from the genus Salvia are wonderful for bees and butterflies. They bloom. There's like many different species, so you can find the right one for your conditions. They're really great pollinator plant. Asters are another great plant that tend to bloom a little bit later in the summer. So it's nice to have that late fall or late summer, early fall nectar. Dumbweed, Grindelia species, that's another great late summer, early fall nectar plant, and it's super drought tolerant. Some other things that I like for pollinators, penstemons, mimulus, also called monkey flowers, ribes, so things like currants or gooseberries are really great for that early spring nectar. Manzanitas are another one. Monarchs like manzanita. Yarrow is great and seemingly foolproof. It seems to grow anywhere, and lots of bees like it. Native grasses are also important to grow. There are a lot of species of butterflies, especially things like skippers, that use grasses as host plants. There are some species of bumblebees that nest at the base of bunch grasses. So don't forget about grasses. Native thistles are wonderful pollinator plants. Hummingbirds love them, bees love them. I was lucky enough to find some cobweb thistle, which is native to California, to plant in my yard. And every time I went and looked at it, there were bees just like swimming around in the bloom. So they're really, they're cool looking and they're really great. California fuchsia is a great one for hummingbirds and for watching carpenter bees. They're pollen thieves on fuchsia, so they kind of bite into the outside of the flower and steal the nectar without pollinating it. Columbine, I like in my yard. I have a lot of shade in my backyard, so I've got some columbine. So these are just a a few plants that I like. But there are many more, and you can find tons of plant lists on our website. Okay, I'm almost done here. I'm going to talk about some community science projects that you can participate in. So again, there's the Thanksgiving count for those of you who live near the coast. If you haven't been involved in that before and would like to, you can check that out and participate next year. We also have the Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper. So this is a way for us to learn more about the biology of Western monarchs, where they are and when, and also the milkweed. So if you're out and about, see a monarch, you see milkweed, you can take a picture of it and upload it to this website. There is an app, it's kind of clunky. I recommend using iNaturalist. You can join the Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper project, and then any milkweed or monarchs that you see, the data will be shared with this community science project. And it really has helped us learn a lot about biology of these species, you know, when do they get to different parts of the West, what stage are they at, and helps us make better management decisions. I mentioned pollinators, so I'll just tell you about Bumblebee Watch, which is a really cool community science project. If you see a picture of a bumblebee, you take a picture of it, upload it to the website, and it has these nice cartoons that help you ID it to species, but then an expert actually reviews your ID for you. So when you plant your pollinator habitat and you're waiting for monarchs to show up, you can take pictures of bumblebees. And for those of you in California, next year we're launching a California Bumblebee Atlas project, which is really cool. So volunteers adopt grid cells and agree to sample those for bumblebees twice a year. There's trainings where you learn about bumblebee biology, you learn how to do the surveying, you learn IDing, and we have these projects in the Pacific Northwest, Nebraska, Missouri. There's one starting that's going to be like Northern Plains. So now California. So it's really exciting to have this, and it helps us learn a lot more about the distribution and biology of bumblebees. Okay, the last thing I want to tell you about is a project we've been running called our habitat kits. So basically we provide plants to people who want to create habitat on working lands or public lands in California. So now we also have habitat kit programs in the Northeast and in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and there may be others in the future. But the way this started, it started in California in 2019 when the monarch population collapsed. We were like brainstorming, how can we get more habitat on the ground? And we're kind of like, well, all of the California staff are already managing as many projects as we can. Like, how do we do this? We realized we just have to help all the people out there, the great people who are out there who already want to do this work. But the cost of the plant materials can be really expensive. Like native plants are expensive. And sometimes you don't know what to plant. It can be a lot. And so we thought, well, if we can provide the plants to people who already are doing this work, we can get a lot more habitat on the ground. So this is a picture of some of the plants we gave away last year. This is a group of a chapter of the Native Plant Society in Southern California, like lovingly hand watering these plants. Among the three projects, the Santa Fe, Northeast, and California, across the 3 years, we've supported 447 planting projects and given away over 150,000. And it's a great way to get habitat on the ground, but also to get people excited about this. This photo is San Joaquin Delta College, the horticulture school planted this kit, and now they use it as outdoor class space. This is a picture of the kit locations in California. And so this light blue area is the priority 1 area for monarch restoration, and the dark blue area is the priority 2 area. So basically the light blue area is the places where monarchs are likely to breed for that first generation in spring. And so where the the Fish and Wildlife and Xerces and a lot of other organizations have agreed is maybe the most important place to get habitat in the ground, though all of California and the West, I think, is still important. So these are the locations of our kits the last few years in California. We have regionally specific kits, so they're tailored to the Central Valley or foothills or Southern California. And we use sort of drought tolerant native plants that will benefit monarchs and pollinators. We have 3 types of kits. The grassland kit has 1,600 plants, so it's really big. That may change next year. I'm not 100% sure yet. We have hedgerow kits. So in California, a lot of people plant hedgerows, like flowering hedgerows, especially in agricultural land. So each of these hedgerow kits is enough for 100 feet of hedgerow. So you can ask for the number that you need. So if you want to plant 900 feet of hedgerow, you could ask for 9 kits. And then we have some garden kits, which are good for public gardens like schools or community gardens. So this has been a great program. My coworker Jessa and I have been running this for the last 3 years, and it's really rewarding. The people are wonderful. It's just inspiring to see how many people are working so hard to create habitat in their communities, and just to see so many people who care so much about an insect, because most people are adverse to insects. Anyway, if you know of a project, those of you in California, where you have been wanting to do some habitat work in either working land or public space, or things like land trusts, you can email me if you have any questions, but our applications will be out next March for the next round of kits. So you can watch for that if it's something that you're interested in. Again, if you have questions, you can email me. Our website, I was recently told we have over 1,000 PDFs on our website, which is maybe a little bit intimidating. But if you have questions about creating habitat or pollinators or pesticides, we probably have a fact sheet on it on our website for free. A good place to look is the Pollinator Resource Center, where we have resources grouped by state. So you can look up what state you're in and get lots of different great information about creating habitat for monarchs and other pollinators. And with that, I'll stop talking. Thank you for listening. I can take questions.
Okay, there were lots of questions. The chat was super active. Thank you for that really engaging presentation, Angela. I really love the concept of thinking in a community landscape scale, that even if we feel like our impact is small, I just have a few pots on my deck or something, that it is connected. And that really is important for all of us to remember that. So thank you for putting that concept of community landscape scale in our minds. There were a few questions in the chat, and I'd love to pose them to you. We had a lot of people answering the questions in the chat, which was really helpful too, and so many postings of links and places to go for more information. And just to remind everyone, I will be sending a follow-up email that will have those links. So rest assured that when this ends, that you'll still get the information. So a couple questions. Let's see. I think you answered a lot of them about, how drought and how climate change is affecting monarch populations. A couple people asked about eucalyptus trees. The eucalyptus trees are not native. So what native trees work to provide the right habitat in overwintering sites?
Right. So we do advocate native species. The overwintering sites are a little bit different. Monarchs will use native plants like Monterey cypress, Coast West redwood. So they will use those native species. One advantage to eucalyptus is that it grows fast. So if we need to replace some trees that are down, sometimes maybe eucalyptus is the best choice. So when it comes to those overwintering sites, we use sort of a mix of species, and a lot of it is just thinking ahead, how are these trees looking? Do we need to start planting some of these slower growing trees now so that they'll be mature when some of these other eucalyptus are going to die? So just having to think about the biology of the trees and how fast the growth rate of different trees is important. Emma Pelton is our lead, Monarch lead at Xerces, and she does a lot of our overwintering sites. We did recently receive funding from the state to work with, I think it's 5 different sites to create management plans for their overwintering sites. And there is a working group that's working on this and actively trying to think about the best way to do it.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Let's see. Another question about milkweed. A couple of people were saying, I've heard that planting milkweed's great, and I've heard that I shouldn't be planting it. And then, so if you could address that, are there cases where you shouldn't be? And then someone else asked that it's not helpful. They're wondering if it's true, if it's not helpful to plant milkweed if you live outside of 5 miles of the coast. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, I think it's great to plant native milkweed. If you're near an overwintering site, then I would not plant milkweed near the overwintering sites. Our rule of thumb has sort of been 5 miles from the coast north of Santa Barbara. So north of Santa Barbara, don't plant milkweed within 5 miles of the coast. But it kind of depends on, the individual site and how close it is to overwintering sites. South of Santa Barbara, our rule of thumb is 1 mile, but I think the best thing to do is just plant native milkweeds first of all, and then don't plant them too close to overwintering sites because they don't need them. There's some evidence that they might be disrupting their behavior as to whether or not they go into diapause. So we just try to mimic the historical distribution of milkweeds. And for those of you in California, CalScape is a wonderful resource. And if you look up the different species, they'll come up with maps that show you the distribution of the species.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Are there Spanish language resources on the Xerces website?
We have a few, but not nearly enough. We have been talking about trying to get more of our publications in Spanish. If there are some things in particular that you're looking for, we have been having discussions about what would be most useful, like different groups of people. For example, urban gardeners aren't really interested in our farming literature. So if there's something in particular that you're interested in, you could drop me a line and it would be helpful to know what types of things people are looking for in other languages and what languages too. Because in California, there's lots of languages all over the world of people in the US that speak many different languages. So it'd just be good to know what people need.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Let's see. Here's another one. Can you address the orange oleander aphids that attach to milkweed in mass? I've heard some people say that monarchs will not use plants that are heavily infested with them.
Yeah, they're gross. They're a nuisance. I do sometimes kind of scrape them off. It does seem like monarchs tend to prefer the plants that have fewer aphids on them. Though it's hard to, if you control them, you want to do so in a way that's not going to harm the milkweed. It's not, I feel like there's not a lot of great evidence on how the caterpillars and the aphids interact. So I don't have a great answer for that. I know that they are gross, but I leave them on my milkweed. And what I found, I have this one tiny patch of yard that's sunny where I've got some showy milkweed and narrow leaf milkweed. And I find that the aphids tend to choose like 1 or 2 plants, and then 1 or 2 plants are left empty, and I just ignore them. And the monarchs seem to just choose the other plants. But I don't know anything about my aphids except occasionally like push them off. It's gross, but they're gross. So.
Okay, thank you for that. There's all kinds of conversation going on in the chat about those aphids too, and ladybugs. So thank you everyone for sharing in the chat as well. There's two more questions I'd love to touch on in our remaining 5 minutes. One is about tagging milkweeds. Tagging monarchs. Is there a practice of tagging monarchs? Is it done for the purpose of counting in certain areas?
Right. So there are programs that put little stickers on monarchs, and then usually it's in the overwintering site where people can see those stickers and then report it. And tagging monarchs has been really good for giving us information about the migration, especially early on when we didn't know much about monarchs and where they were going. There are still people doing it now. In California, you need a permit, which is hard to get. But it usually goes to researchers. But it can provide useful information. It's usually just a sticker. So if you're out at an overwintering site and you see a sticker on a monarch butterfly, you can report that.
Very good. And one more question. I do a lot of youth education, and I know there's a lot of people out there that do as well. Thank you, David Berman, for this question. Love the focus on what you can do and the emphasis on that. I think we're always trying to inspire people to care more, and we can all get out there and make a difference. But what have been your favorite ways to reach out to kids?
Yeah, I love interacting with kids outside, especially young kids, because they haven't yet learned that they're supposed to be grossed out by insects, right? And it's so much fun to be with the kids that are still excited about it. I feel like there's just something that a lot of people learn to be like grossed out by insects. Like my sister is like the poster child for that. And I think just being outside and showing them things, I think there's something about just like catching bugs and looking at them up close. And just even gardening, like we planted this pollinator garden, and we had kids, these were from 7th grade to 12th graders who came and helped plant. And this one kid, he's a teenager, and he was so excited. He's like, can I just come out here and work on the weekends? And I think he had probably never worked in a garden before, but it was so exciting to him. And so I feel like anytime we can do that, it's so important for kids to build that connection with nature so that they care about it. And also it gives them exposure to, science and ecology. And so I think it's really important. I think the best thing to do is just to get outside and start looking at stuff and seeing how much is there that you don't notice when you just start looking up close. And the good thing about most native bees, honeybees tend to sting, wasps are aggressive, but most of our native bees are gentle and don't sting. So you don't have to worry about them as much. And of course, everybody loves butterflies.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that's a really positive note to wrap up with. Thank you so much. I feel like I learned a lot also and feel inspired on so many different levels, even about creating high school programs and connecting them to vacant lots and planting more milkweed and more pollinator friendly plants out there. So thank you for taking the time to be with us tonight. Again, please, we will be sending lots of resources to you in a follow-up email. And Angela, do you want to share your email address right now, or should I just put that in the
Yeah, I'll type it in here.
Okay.
It's angela.laws@xerces.org. Thanks for all the great questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get to them all, but tons of information on our site, or if there's something specific, you can email me.
Yes. All right. Thank you. And again, thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. And thank you for caring about creating more pollinator friendly habitat in your area. All right. We'll see you next time. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.